Okay, I was promised you. We get to put a dipstick into the House of Representatives this morning. And that is to pull in a dipstick and pull it out to see how much oil is left after the crossover. You know what I mean? It's time now that all these bills that made it, now they get further tweaked and deliberated. We go back and forth and we end up with a legislative package. Now, some of you may have seen this, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier. A very interesting editorial this morning in the Star Advertiser, and it's simply titled Legislature on a Solid, Safe Path. And the operative word here is safe. And Aaron Johanson and I will sort of explain this because it was almost for a minute, Aaron, I was looking at this morning and say, wait a minute, are these guys looking at the same legislature I'm looking at? Because I was thinking of maybe not too controversial of a session because it's a election year. Is that where the word safe comes from?
I think that's definitely where it comes from.
Yeah, good morning, by the way.
Morning. Yeah. And I think it also depends on, whose perspective you're looking at. Some of these measures that they cite as, solid and safe, definitely going to have some deleterious impacts on small businesses and probably on the economy and on our bottom line in terms of spending. So, that's the advertiser's caricature of how we are at the present moment.
Well, if we went backwards and looked at, say, for instance, the special session, the controversial part of this session would have been that. So that got dealt with in sort of limbo time, and maybe out of sight, out of mind. It doesn't look like it's that way with some groups, but by and large, it didn't really. That whole question didn't come up much during the session.
You don't see a lot of social policy issues in this legislature because those tend to be the most polarizing.
Exactly. In an election year, that's not good. I still think, though, that people don't really understand who's being elected. They know that it is not a presidential year, but they do know that there is, some importance here that we are having a gubernatorial race, for instance. And certainly maybe people don't understand. The House is cleaning house. Everybody's up.
Yeah, every 2 years. Yeah. Every election is always all of the House people up.
And so that's that's actually easier to gauge because isn't that a window that people have enough memory? Oh, I don't like the way that guy voted on my issue.
You would think, but because it's as much as it is frequently up, it's probably the least paid attention to races. Most people are focused on the big ticket things, whether it's the gubernatorial race or the presidential race or senators or what's happening in Congress. But people don't pay that much attention, I think, unfortunately, to the state legislature and particularly to their state representatives.
Well, one thing that I've always been amused at is that, we have a sort of a weekly recap of our delegation on the major issues in Washington, D.C., how your delegates voted. And it shows them in lockstep. I mean, Colleen Hanabusa has gone, I will say, a couple of times, but pretty much lockstep. Everybody votes the same way. I think that we should have that same opportunity to see in the press that. Because I do know that real interest parties, they can go online and find this out anytime they want.
Yeah, but even that's not very easy for people unless they know what measure they're looking at. And the way it's listed is never
pertaining to this, whatever.
It's never a 51-member tally where you can easily see yes or no. And typically, when you look at it in the newspaper, it's only on the hot button issues. They did that as a
4 or
recap
5
of special session, but how people voted on SB1. But you rarely see enough data in a consumable format for the average person for them to really be able to tell easily what everybody's up to.
Do you think that a number of your constituents are reading this editorial and sitting back and smirking because they've dodged a bullet? Nobody really came after anybody.
My guess is they're not sure what to make of it because there's so much inside baseball that goes on at the Capitol, and it's part of what's great about being able to be here with you is to be able to demystify it a little bit and add some real color to it.
It really helps. I mean, I get comments on this all the time. I play that little piece, How a Bill Becomes a Law, a lot. And even though it's comedic, it's true. I mean, we just have no idea. And furthermore, and I want to tell you that I've got a dear friend, his name is Roy Morioka, and Roy and I do a lot of stuff on my fishing show. He's a real advocate for fishermen. And he showed where 6 people showed up at a hearing and made a difference in a pretty serious bill, which would have virtually allowed any inspection of people's boats and trucks and everything instead of having probable cause. Well, it died because there were 6 people. Well, you can imagine what happens if 50 people show up.
Yeah. Well, and I'll give you a prime example. When we were hearing the minimum wage bill in the Labor Committee, the most effective people, and this editorial that you're alluding to in the Star Advertiser criticizes inclusion of the tip credit in the House version of the bill. But the reason the tip credit is still in there is because there's a lot of mom and pop family restaurants that have been around for generations who have advocated well for themselves by showing up and testifying and saying, my grandfather started this restaurant and we can barely make payroll and a profit as it is. And, we at least need the tip credit if you're going to raise the minimum wage.
Yeah, a lot of people think that whole thing is aimed at the fast food guys. And it really isn't.
Yeah.
Because the fast food guys have internal promotion that is almost guaranteed. And if you stay, they pay. So you're only at a minimum wage in one of those places for a ramp up training time anyway.
Right,
isn't that
entry-level wage.
Isn't that what we've all been told to expect? That's what this is. It's an entry level wage. You get this so that you can make ends meet while you learn how to get paid more money.
Yeah, I mean that's what most people, at least in the business industry, believe. I don't know that that's necessarily where everybody is at the Capitol, unfortunately.
Here's a case in point. We've talked about this a lot. The difference between somebody who thinks the government owes them a living and somebody who's proud and going back to work. There are a lot of people, and you've heard this, I'm sure, that when the economy took a dump in the last couple of years, they took a either minimum or just over minimum wage job, highly much more qualified than that, but they were too proud to go down, stand in line, collect. They wanted to do something.
Well, and what most people forget in Hawaii is that the cost of living is so incredibly high that you have a lot of professionals who also take minimum wage jobs as a second job. I know so many teachers who, in order to basically make ends meet, end up as servers on the side. It's just
and you know what?
Number.
I so admire that because they're goal-oriented people, or they're realists. They look at the way things are and it sort of goes away. But there's another thing. And I don't think this is the only. I mean, I agreed a lot with what Senator Clayton had to say about the minimum wage. But the one thing that I didn't was the example that he keeps using. Well, the median house price is $600,000, and was it ever even thought of in somebody's wildest dreams that a minimum wage earner could buy a house?
I mean, it's a correlation
without a huge inheritance.
Unfortunately, almost no one can buy a house in Hawaii. That's part of our
not
problem.
That's it. Not just a minimum. See, this ties in with what you are talking about, and that is a way to address the cost of living for everybody, not just minimum wage people.
Yeah. The problem with so much of what you hear at the legislature is there is a concession that we are going to continue to keep the cost of living high, so we just have to pursue measures that keep pace with that, instead of fundamentally attacking the root of the problem, which is the high cost of living, so that no matter what wage you make, you have a higher quality of life. Yeah,
we did have a call the other day from a restaurateur in Waikiki and said that, if this happens, it will be a bump in the road for some of us that are higher volume, but we will have to expect more from our current employees because we'll have to downsize, either not filling the position or not expanding
their hours.
So that means that somebody that's working hard is going to have to bust a little bit more, few more tables in the same period of time to keep the customers happy. And in the final analysis, that those that do buckle under have no option but to put their prices up. They just, in other words, they just can't stay in business.
Yeah, and I think that's where you used a great phrase, where the rubber meets the road, because a lot of what's discussed at the Capitol sometimes is way too theoretical. And in theory, everything is great in theory, but where the rubber meets the road is when a business is forced to say, am I going to close, or am I going to, do what I have to do to survive? It's going to do what it has to
Everybody,
do to survive.
small business, we're going to all tighten our belts, do what they have to do. But see, you may have heard I was talking about a national story about this tsunami of store closings. I mean, let's say that you have I have a Radio Shack in Hawaii Kai. And is that going to be one of the 1,100 stores closing? Maybe. All of a sudden, minimum wage or not, there's a bunch of people unemployed. So we can't just keep thinking we just can keep putting this thing up, because it backfires.
Well, and it speaks to the broader point that nationally, and both even in the state, nobody's positive. We're certainly not in robust economic growth, which is why nobody's gutsy enough to be able to take a lot of risks as business, to expand
We've been
and to
told
grow.
that everything's okay, that we're on this fast track. But the stock market is the first one to really vet that and say, wait a minute, no, we're not. We're just going to be cautious here.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even on a state level, I mean, the Council of Revenues changed its forecast earlier on in the year, and I'm sure it'll actually revise downward. Tourism's been flat, so things are okay, but things are not great here.
When we deliberate different things, we're going to talk specifically about some bills today that are coming up this week with you. But how often does that play into the factoring when somebody will come up and say, well, this would have been okay, but remember the Council on Revenues is predicting this shortfall. This bill is one of the ones that probably won't get funded if we pass it anyway.
It factors into a lot, which is why most of the bills are backloaded in that, they all go to conference committee and everybody's watching the budget, which should be passing out of the House this week, actually.
I was going to say this week, right?
Yeah.
More of that coming up. Your opportunity to join us. No email during the session. Phone calls only. 296-KHNR. That's 296-5467 here on The Answer. Oh, yeah. Things change, but things stay the same. Don't mess with my toot-toot, is a man saying. So, St. Patty's Day is a week from today. Hope you're getting ready, right? And if it's the luck of the Irish you're looking at, I'm wondering if that's how the legislative session sometime rolls out. And we're talking a little bit today with Ling Johanson. If you want to chat, you may join us. I'm getting email, but we don't take email, and that's because we don't want people to think that we in any way stack the deck or try to tip the cards in any one direction. We don't do that, but we do give you an opportunity. And I wish that we had stuff that was more political that we could debate with people that wanted to debate. But there are some things that are happening right now that are really no-brainers, and then there are some that are likely to get shelved. Do you think that there's some meaty stuff, like, for instance, what's on tap for this week? What sort of things are you looking at?
Well, I think right now that we're considering Senate bills and vice versa, and so we're just getting started in the second round of this. But more broadly, the legislature, some of the meatier things that the legislature is considering are revisions to the Hawaii Community Development Authority. What falls under their purview, what rights, responsibilities, authorities do they have, exemptions do they have? That's sort of the focal point for the broader conversation about development and land use in the state.
There was recently, there's always, depending on what neighborhood you get into, controversial stuff. And I know that's when we talk about people responding when they think it's going to affect their lifestyle or their quiet enjoyment or their whatever. That's when they're going to be vehemently vocal about stuff. Yeah. Am I right? Usually people that go down and testify are people that are testifying against something.
Yes, that's typically true. Or they're passionately in support of something, but it's usually easier to get people out when they're upset about something. There's
some people that are saying that whole development authority ought to be just thrown out. It's just not. It's just cumbersome. It's not working. Nobody appreciates the decisions they come up with. That's got to be sort of thin ice for people to walk on that are in it.
Yeah, it is, and it's difficult because if you're a Kakako resident, you probably feel very differently than if you are a member of the trades hoping to have a job to put up a building that's there.
Well, that being said, I think neighborhood by neighborhood, everybody has seen that. Right now in my neck of the woods, there's a controversy about what you can use your home for. In other words, if whether a place having weddings is okay to do that. Well, that you would think that all has code and standards that you just go look at. If it applies, they can do it. If it doesn't, they don't. But it seems like there's always something coming up and more bills to look at that kind of stuff too, right? Neighborhood businesses and neighborhoods.
Yep, that's what keeps the city council and the state legislature in business year after year after year.
I think that some of the people look at state rules and regulations and they think, well, they're in compliance, so they're okay. There is a time that one trumps over another, just like doesn't the Fed trump the state and doesn't the state trump the county?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And you see that one of the things also talked about in this Star Advertiser editorial is the lifting of the cap on the transient accommodation tax and what's remitted to the counties. So, yes, that is definitely the state's prerogative, much often to the county's chagrin, that the state can just sort of say, this is now our prerogative, we're taking it from you, or we're taking this away from you and making it a state jurisdiction.
There was something else that I thought was rather interesting, and that is in the holding pattern that seems to be like this editorial this morning that calls it solid and safe path, with so much depending on what you were talking about, the revenues, I would imagine that an awful lot of these bills are really going to be last minute and subject to the dreaded, bait and switch or,
They are.
Yeah.
In the committee process, it's always referred to, especially in conference committee, as Ways and Means or Finance Committee approval. And most bills, if they don't have that, never make it off the chopping block.
Sure. I would think that any new bill that has cost attached to it then would be suspect by saying, look, we can't make current expenditures, let alone new expenditures. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's always a very careful, watchful eye with respect to any new spending and anything called for in a new bill.
Let me ask you this: Are there bills, and if so, are there a lot of bills that don't have dollars attached to them? One would think that, how could that be? Well, maybe just something that's being written to clarify something that was not being understood before.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they don't all cost money.
Yeah, that's definitely the case.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's just changing somebody's jurisdiction. Sometimes it's reclassifying some kind of criminal offense, or certain just legal changes that don't always often have a fiscal price tag.
One of the things that I do know that we're looking at, Department of Prisons and everything else, and in this time of tough funding and really uncertainty about revenues, I know that there's still this huge big push to bring our inmates back to Hawaii that are incarcerated on the mainland. But there doesn't seem to be, there seemed to be this big desire, because that sounds good, but it doesn't seem where we have a place to put them. What's happening with bills that are still alive regarding that, regarding improvements or capital improvements or even new construction of a prison?
I don't know that there are necessarily, at least in the House, bills that pertain to that, but it's always a touchy subject. For instance, OCCC is going to be right next to a rail station, basically. So, that's got to be moved. People are looking at new models. For instance, the Federal Detention Center is sort of the Rolls Royce of prisons out by the airport, because it just looks like an apartment building. It doesn't look like a prison, and it's vertical as opposed to a horizontal impact. Looking at probably, I'm sure that there are some properties being considered probably out in the Kalailoa area for a prison. But I think the paradigm that's being examined is sort of, where is the right mixture between rehabilitation as well as safety and how
and cost. Right. I mean, let's face the whole reason the Ling administration and others investigated this and then followed through with it, because dollars and cents wise, there didn't look like there was an alternative, I guess.
Right, both cost in the immediate of housing them, but also cost in the long-term perspective of recidivism rates and likely to repeat crime.
That is something that always comes under a problem when you have a gubernatorial election. And there's a lot of opponents right now that are lining themselves up against Governor Abercrombie, saying, look, under your watch, this is happening or that's happening. So that must be another area where it becomes sort of a political football in the legislature, because you don't want to accuse of aligning with one candidate or another.
It definitely does add an added dimension, a fun dimension to it. And one thing that's most difficult for any incumbent, particularly a governor, because unlike the legislature, there's only one governor. So it's much easier to hold accountable. And I think what you see a lot, especially in these past few days of the newspapers, are, does the rhetoric match the results? And there's a lot of results being talked about. I've seen his commercial for his $844 million surplus. Is that really true? You know
what? When you said that last time, Aaron, I totally agree with you, and that's why I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing, because I looked at it and said, if I were the governor, I'd come up with a new commercial right away and say, for those of you that don't understand how this works, here's what the surplus is, and here's why we have this money, or blah blah blah. Because right now, everybody is, including his opponent in the primary, is just having pot shots at him on that.
Right, because it's only that big because the legislature cut so much of it in 2013. It wouldn't be that large if we weren't reducing his expenditures.
Well, you see, the thing that I am most concerned about, though, is a reality check that we have in that we mandatorily have to balance our budget. And what I want...
It's one of our saving graces.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that I want to talk about when we come back after the news break is it seems to me like we're setting up adversarial relationships inadvertently between the counties and the state right now because of the TAT, number one. Everybody wants it. And it's because the counties are saying, hey, look, we know that the state can't print it, but we're at the other end of the dog here. We're the tail. We certainly can't make money. We need, and yet you expect us to provide statewide services, then who's going to pay for it?
Yeah, no, that's definitely where the rub is.
Yeah. Okay, now, if you got a question in that area or in that field and you want to talk to Aaron Johanson, you can do that. The number is 296-KHNR or 296-5467, okay? So second half of this is we're going to look at some of his favorite pet bills, but we're also going to continue on this a little bit more. In one of the big bills, what surprises did the minority caucus have in the House when they received all of these Senate bills to take a look at? And now that they've had a time to digest a whole bunch of them and read them, because all of them did a lot of midnight burning oil, so they know they're going to get into a committee and start talking about this stuff.
Mike Buck, all Honolulu, all the time. On AM 690, The Answer.
Okay, so all that music I played for Brother Chaz, I hit my mouse twice in a row on the Mike Buck Show. My bad. Ay. Now we got it back together. Aaron Ling Johanson in the house. What's that? Oh yeah. Right in the middle of that whole thing. Let's get Charlie Garrett from the Surf News Network, and he'll fix you right up with a surf report. Good morning, Charlie.
Good morning, Brother Mike. And yes, we've got good news for back to work Monday. It's pretty good out there. We've got great conditions with the light trades at 5 to 15 miles per hour. It's glassy around the island, and we still have surf on a declining northwester as well. Sunset Beach and Pipeline topping our wave height list. And we'll give it 3 to 5 with occasional pluses still, but it's rapidly dwindling down. So get on out there. Already getting a little crowded. And the big swell rolls in on Wednesday, so we're stoked about that. West side 2 to 4 plus. South Shore is still looking fun in the 1 to 2 foot range for the longboarders. Really clean conditions. East Shore's at 1 to 2 plus. Low tide 7:45 this morning. High at noon 45, and I will see you in the water today. Please don't drop in on me. It's Charlie Garrett along with brother Mike Buck for SurfNewsNetwork.com, AM 690, The Answer.
Thank you, Charlie. And hey, he's right. Save up your brownie points so that you can go hang 10 or 12 or whatever. Wednesday, Thursday, going to be right back at you. Okay, one of the things we were talking with Aaron Johanson before the break there was the crossover. The big crossover was last week, as you know. And sometimes they say, well, that's when one body punts to the next body all the stuff that they were working on right up to then. And I know you have a pretty good handle on some of the things, and I do know it takes a while to digest what's coming from the other guys. But what did you guys send their way that's significant, that you hope that they take a look at and sort of meld their version of it together with and come out with some needed stuff?
Sure. I think there were several thematic elements that we looked at, and it was long. We were on the floor last Tuesday from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. So there's a lot of talking going on, but several versions of basically internet sales tax. 3 of them passed over from the House to the Senate. Let's stop on that one for a minute, because I want you to expand on that, because just earlier today we're going on this story about this rapid expansion, many say over-expansion of national retailers, that they're closing stores by the hundreds and thousands. And it's because 10 to 15% off of sales in brick and mortar, 10 to 15 increase in sales on the internet. It's not just little Hawaii, right? Isn't everybody looking at this as a big issue? Everybody is.
Yeah.
There are a handful of states already that basically have some kind of nexus or use tax, which basically allows them to tax the purchases that are made online, even if it's not a physical presence in their state.
Yeah, but Aaron, look at how some of these big internet guys got when they said, all right, well, no problem, we'll just cut your state off. And then all the consumers called up their legislators, don't let them cut us off. That's the only way we can exist.
Right. And much as people make the argument in our legislature that this is just about, tax fairness, that's often used for people who are proponents, this is tax fairness. What people don't often consider, though, is right now, if the tax is not being applied by the internet retailer to the purchase, it's helping to reduce the cost of living for people. And in the end, consumers are concerned with the bottom line at the end of the purchase.
Well, what substantiates that argument was all these stores are saying, look, how much of a bricks and mortar presence do we have to have anymore? When our own sales are exponentially increasing on the internet, why should we have a Hawaii Kai Radio Shack when everybody in Hawaii Kai can go clickety-click and get the stuff delivered the next day? It's actually, and sometimes when you buy online, it's quicker than going and getting it.
That's true.
Yeah.
What's interesting, though, about Hawaii, too, is that the shipping sometimes is dramatically more expensive than it would be on the mainland. So
I also think that it is over-blamed and that a lot of people just particularly want to just say shipping. And there have been a number of people in retail and in shipping that have taken advantage of our remoteness by adding on a nickel or two.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so, too. And some people don't ship to us. I really wish
Yeah,
IKEA would
yeah.
ship to us, but we're one of
Don't
the
you hate that?
2 locations they don't.
I hate that. You see an ad in the magazine or online and say, price is good except for Alaska and Hawaii.
Right.
Because we're stepchildren and don't deserve the break.
Right.
Or whatever.
Except
And
for
then
their bottom line.
one big box, which shall remain nameless, Costco, when you get their thing, they say shipping included except Alaska and Hawaii. Oh, you just hate that, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those bills are moving, and they're depending on the House and the Senate have never agreed. I mean, I've seen versions of this every year that I've been in office, but the House and the Senate have never agreed. If they do agree, people could see their online purchases becoming more expensive because the equivalent of the general excise tax would then actually be levied at the final end purchase.
Okay, I'm going to assume that right up until recently, in the last couple of years, one of the Republican responses would have been, we have to have free trade. But then the reality sets in on when you're seeing, okay, when a company like a Radio Shack or a Best Buy or anybody comes up and says, well, we're basing our store's performances on the fact that people would rather shop on the internet and save some money. Isn't that a sort of a ploy by the retailer to keep making the same kind of money but not have the same kind of expense? Because the minute they close the store, they have no rent, no employees, no nothing.
Well, and that's sort of the free market at work.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that as a caucus we all oppose, because local bricks and mortar, like you pointed out, can also take advantage of the internet and expand their retail base. And sometimes it's harder for them. I'm not pretending that there aren't challenges in doing that. And I don't know that you're ever going to compete with a Walmart or
you got to laugh because somebody called the show the other day and said something pretty valuable, and that was, hey, you know what? These big boxes, they all come over here, and then they got to localize their merchandise. Because it's true. You can't open a Target in Akron and in Honolulu and sell the same stuff.
Yeah. So
because we don't want fuzzy jackets in the summertime. We want slippers that they don't want there.
The down jacket is not as requisite here. But I think in the end, what our caucus just felt like is the consumer has to absorb so much here, again, because of our incredible cost of living that shouldn't be as high as it is, but it is. We just didn't want to pass that on, an extra cost that exacerbates that cost.
There's another question that comes up, that if they were taxed, at what rate they would be taxed at. For instance, here in Hawaii, we have this tax, which is an excise tax rather than a sales tax. Would the bills talk about putting that percentage on? Because if that's the case, it's like 11%, which we talked about before, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, to be completely honest. I don't know that the bills, they might be silent on that because a lot of the bills are establishing a framework to do something. Establishing the framework at the legislature to do something is always tantamount to doing it, but it's a way sometimes you don't have to actually include the nitty-gritty and the details in something.
I think that's a mistake a lot of us make, that we look at that one line that says pertaining to. I want to mention my friend Roy Morioka, because we've spent a lot of time on lots and lots of bills that affect the fishery and hunting and fishing and all the things that are dear to us, hobby-wise and recreation-wise. But, until you start really interpreting that, it gets very difficult. And you talked before about thematic elements. Let's talk about some of the other things passed from the House to the Senate that the Senate needs to take a grip on, because that's the House's priority. And if the House is going to look at their bills with a sense of urgency, they have to look at your bills.
Some of the other big themes, there were 3 or so bills that had to do with hotel tax credits, whether it's, and they differ. Some of them had to do with renovating. Some of them had to do with incentivizing new hotel construction. Some of it had to do with defraying some of the cost of labor of hiring additional staff people in the hotel. So, there's a lot of focus on tourism coming out of the House and a lot of focus on economic development. It is interesting because, and this is where I think the meat factory sausage grinder analogy of the legislature is a good one, because the legislature often pursues things that are not a consistent framework. So on one hand, we just talked about things that I think, particularly whether it's the minimum wage or some of these other, we didn't talk about all the taxes and fees that passed out, but make it harder to do business, but at the same time passing tax credits to incentivize business. And, you often get a lot of that where it's not a consistent policy framework coming out of one body or another, and it's more just people's individual priorities.
Okay, well, let's not talk about the Senate for a minute. Let's talk about the House. And do you think that many measures in the House were impacted by the outcry and outrage, if you will, over the electric companies' ability to say no or yes, and either the disappearance or creation of new credits to keep us incentivized to convert to solar photovoltaics?
Oh, most definitely. That's another large thematic
That's a big
area
one, isn't it?
Of the House.
Yeah.
There are several bills addressing grid modernization, whether HECO can unilaterally make decisions, in this case, the application of that study fee after you've installed your PV, and made that huge investment. So lots of, and the increasing cost of electricity, all these things were the catalysts for legislation along that, as well as how to get to critical mass with the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative.
One thing, though, that I can tell you, and I know because I know that you cringe when you hear some of these things, but what's happening is everybody's looking at ways to find new money. In other words, the tourism bills that are being looked at are to create more tourism because the council says our numbers are down, so we have to create more numbers. Right. But they're talking about always in creating numbers, creating money, and in increasing expense. When you're sitting there saying, wait a minute, my mantra is doing this. Aaron Johanson is with us, and you can be part of the conversation. We still have some great ground to cover as we start looking at the House bills that made it to the Senate, and more importantly, later on, the Senate bills that are making it to the House.
Mike Buck on AM 690. The Answer.
What is hip? What is hip and fashionable? Well, it almost doesn't matter. It's what is practical and what we can afford. Aaron Johanson from the Republican Minority Party is in the House as we discuss things on Mondays, talking about what's going on. And the big deal is that the crossover has happened, and we're talking about some of the bills that were debated and argued and formed by the House that went over to the Senate. What a lot of people don't understand, Aaron, is how it works, because a lot of times when the public looks at something, they see SB this, HB that everybody works on sort of the same stuff, but not always. In other words, there are some Senate bills that there is no corresponding House bill, and there's some House bills that there's no corresponding Senate. Are there any of those that the House moved over to the Senate and wants looked at?
I'll probably have a better answer for you that, in successive radio sessions, just because I haven't seen many of these Senate bills. In fact, this is the first week we're starting to see them, and most of the ones that we're starting to see this week are just Senate iterations of a House.
Yeah, but what you were saying, though, is just before the break, Aaron, you were saying that the main work, burning the midnight oil, was to get all the bills that were important to the House cleaned up and signed off on so they could get that they could get crossed over.
Yeah.
And we talked about some of them. When we were talking about tax credits a minute ago before the break, there are a lot of people that want to be incentivized, whether it's the film business or like you said earlier, isn't there some bill that is going to decide what different sort of credits different hoteliers can get for either capital improvements or new construction or changing to not be so relying on electricity due to their own stuff. There's a lot of categories where people want credits.
Yeah, there are. And, there was a manufacturing tax credit that passed out of the House. There were, renewable energy credits. There were all kinds of, investment type, small business type tax credits.
The thing that I don't know if people understand, maybe you can explain it, is that a lot of these things, while on the surface they would benefit the businesses that are affecting, but what in actual fact it does is tickle and stimulate the economy. I mean, is this one of the major differences between the two parties? One saying we want all these credits, and the other one saying we don't want anybody getting credits.
No, I mean, I think there's a fair amount of bipartisan support for tax credits. I think.
Is it out of desperation? there better be tax credits because we don't have enough money?
I think in this state, yes.
Yeah.
Because it's such a difficult business climate that people are far more willing to entertain it. In an ideal world, if we had a great business climate, you probably would see less support for tax credits. But if people aren't, again, fundamentally willing to attack the root of the problem, which is high cost of doing business, high cost of living, and bad business climate, then people at the legislature are constantly looking for Band-Aid solutions. And I'm not implying that a tax credit is a Band-Aid. It's certainly far more substantive than that. But it's looking at treating the affliction, not looking at treating the cause
and and I don't want to say that you sound like a broken record on that, but in actual fact, unless we do some cost cutting, we're kidding ourselves, because we can't just keep manufacturing dollars. For instance, we talked about the energy credits, and that's for homeowners.
Right.
What about ag credits for people that want to start off in something? There's always, how many times have you heard, well, there's no land in Hawaii to develop? That's not true. I mean, we have a lot of land that could be ag identified. It is ag identified, and if we incentivize somebody to go out and work the fields, we could grow something there.
Yeah. I mean, we are a land poor state, but we just typically don't have the zoning for things, or the collective will, sometimes the political will, to do it. And that's why you see a lot of talk about reaching critical mass in the urban core.
Oh yeah. Well, look at how many more people now are talking about kaka'ako than ever did. I mean, before, people used to avoid it, right?
Right.
Oh, that's kaka'ako. Get away from it. Too much industry.
Just a bunch of warehouses.
Yeah, a bunch of warehouses. No place to park.
But now a lot of the people who want to keep the country realize that if you're going to do that, then you have to build up in the urban core. And so I think the reason I mention it so much is because I think this is where we as a legislature fall short, is that we often are not attacking the root causes of problems. And that's why we don't fundamentally see change. We see some incremental progress here and there, but we don't fundamentally see change because we're not actually and it's not just, I think, a money thing. Some of it's a regulatory thing. There are so many things that we responsibilities that we place on business, small business, and some of them are good, but a lot of them are not good, and they're just extra burdens. So.
And that being said, you talked before about the business atmosphere. We every now and again, we just get all excited when somebody's going to move a base of operations to Hawaii. It doesn't happen very often. But when some people say that they're going to do that, then they take a look at things like infrastructure, and they take a look at schools and look at transport. Now that the rail issue has sort of been decided at the county level, how much of any of the legislature was developed around possible revenues or costs associated with the rail project?
One of the ideas that you see in both House and Senate bills is then looking at transit-oriented development and catalyzing that. So, there's still an excess with the state legislature, and there are people who, are feeling if the station's going to get built, then let's make sure that the state lands around the stations are working to harness that energy and try to.
What about the argument that's come up, and I've had this actually before, and I'm sorry that I didn't ask you early in the piece, that there's always a contingent of people that say, look, the state's got a lot of land, and to solve some of these problems and these budget shortfalls, just sell the land. And I mean, you talked about us being land poor. We think we're land poor. But in actual fact, does the state own too much land that they're not doing anything with, and should it be made available for, privatization or development?
Yeah, I mean, I think the state has to consider every single option. I don't know that the state is necessarily flush with a ton of excess land, because most of the lands that the state have are either rainforests or other things.
Sure. And very necessary ones.
Yeah.
Right?
So, but I think a prudent state will keep in mind every single option as it looks to, a sustainable future.
What about any bills that may have had the hint of privatizing certain functions that are being done by the government? Because I know that a lot of people will make a joke and say, well, that's good enough for government work. And that shouldn't be, it shouldn't be. It should be, well, that's not acceptable for government work. When in actual fact, I do know that there's always a move to take a look at what is something costing, and can we do it more efficiently with going outside.
Yeah, discussions, particularly with respect to the Hawaii Health Systems Corporation, always come up because that's typically bleeding cash, and that's probably one of the major state agencies that there's always discussion every session about potential privatization.
Does anybody understand, or do you guys at the state understand how this health connector works and why we're going to be throwing any more money in it? It's obviously not working very well.
Yeah, it's not working very well, and that was another thematic topic that came out of the House. The House folks and the chairs have looked at trying to make it sustainable. Unfortunately, the Hawaii Health Connector is a victim of the Hawaii prepaid healthcare success,
Which was pretty much going along just fine. Thank you very much.
Yeah. We don't have a critical mass of people here signing up for the Health Connector because we have one of the lowest rates of uninsured in the country, and that is why the Health Connector is not sustainable.
But you know what, Aaron? You're a money guy, okay? And it must pain you to think these people standing up and saying, yeah, but there's still some federal dollars out there. Let's spend them. Mm-hmm. They're actually our own, aren't they?
Yeah.
Didn't we just give them to the Fed and now we're trying to get some of them back?
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, everybody that says, well, the Feds are paying for that, I mean, we seem to forget who the Feds are sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's a good recognition because I had some constituents, some small businesses and constituents call in and say, why is this health connector such a disaster? And it's a good reminder to all of us that we may be thousands of miles away from Washington, D.C., but we're not insulated from the consequences of the legislation that is passed out of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, well said, because that's a little bit worrisome. And I know that you hear this a lot. And some government agencies towards the end of a budgetary year says, well, you hurry up, spend that money. I mean, if you don't spend that, we're not going to get it next time. Mm-hmm. We have this mentality of spend everything. Don't say instead, hey, look, we saved a lot of money. We didn't spend this $300,000.
Well, and I think that's one very positive development that's happened at the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
There are 4 cabinet departments who have basically been a lot more forthcoming to say, we don't need these vacancies. We're willing to get rid of these positions because we don't really need them. Instead of using them as a slush fund for vacation payouts, which is how they were sort of doing it.
Sure, or justifying overtime or whatever have you. Yeah.
Right. And so more truth in accounting, because the response from at least the Finance Committee has been, we're going to honor that, and when you do have a request, it's going to be perceived as far more legitimate because you're being so forthcoming about what you don't need. And maybe what you may need in the future, and that's a very positive cultural change for government.
Yeah, you bet. Well, listen, I can tell you that now it's getting a little bit more serious. For those that don't know, I mean, here we are in the 10th of March, and the session is for all intents and purposes. Yeah.
So not a whole
now it's going to get interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Well, a lot of people are going to be thinking about politicking, and a lot of people are going to be, maybe we won't do that right now. Huh? Okay, Aaron, thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Mike.